May 26, 1938, northern Germany. A swampy marshland near the village of Fallersleben transforms into something else entirely. Thousands of workers pour concrete foundations into earth that still remembers nothing but farmland. Above them, the air hangs thick with cement dust and diesel exhaust. Adolf Hitler himself stands at a podium, beaming at what he calls a symbol of the National Socialist People's Community. Behind him, the skeleton of what will become the largest automobile factory in the world rises from the German countryside. The Führer promises that every German family will own a car, affordable, efficient, engineered to perfection. They call it the Kraft durch Freude Wagen. Strength through joy, the people's car. 336,000 Germans begin saving 5 Reichsmarks per week, trusting the Nazi promise that their patience will be rewarded with automotive freedom. Not a single civilian will ever receive a car from this program. Instead, the factory will build bombs, employ slaves, and kill infants. 87 years later, this same company stands as the largest automaker in Europe, owner of Porsche, Audi, Bentley, and Lamborghini, yet faces the greatest crisis in its history. Is Volkswagen a story of industrial redemption, or a corporation that has never truly escaped the shadow of its origins? The year is 1934, and Adolf Hitler has a problem. Germany possesses magnificent highways, the Autobahnen, stretching across the nation like concrete arteries of the Reich. But these roads remain largely empty. Only 1 in 50 Germans owns an automobile. Cars in 1930s Germany are luxury items, built by companies like Mercedes-Benz and Horch for wealthy industrialists and aristocrats. The average worker earns roughly 150 Reichsmarks per month. A decent automobile costs 2,500 Reichsmarks or more. The mathematics of car ownership excludes almost the entire German population from the freedom of the open road. Hitler understands the political power of mobility. He has watched Henry Ford transform America through mass production of the Model T. He knows that a nation of car owners is a nation invested in the infrastructure of the state, in the roads the government builds, in the fuel the economy provides. The Führer envisions every German family driving on his highways, taking weekend trips to the mountains, feeling the tangible benefits of National Socialist governance. Ideology requires concrete expression. The people's car becomes that expression. Ferdinand Porsche receives the commission in January 1934. The Austrian engineer had already sketched designs for affordable automobiles, including prototypes for NSU and Zündap that never reached production. Hitler's specifications are precise. The car must carry 2 adults and 3 children, cruise at 100 kilometers per hour, consume no more than 7 liters of fuel per 100 kilometers, and cost less than 1,000 Reichsmarks. These parameters seem impossible. No automobile manufacturer in the world has achieved such economy at such a price point. Porsche accepts anyway. The engineer assembles a team at his Stuttgart workshop. They work in secrecy, developing prototype after prototype. The design takes radical departures from conventional wisdom. Instead of a front-mounted water-cooled engine, Porsche places an air-cooled flat 4 in the rear of the vehicle. This eliminates the need for a radiator, reducing weight, cost, and complexity. The body takes a rounded aerodynamic shape, tested extensively in wind tunnels at the Zeppelin Works in Friedrichshafen, that will eventually earn the car its iconic nickname. The result was a drag coefficient remarkably low for its era, approximately 0.48, that reduced power requirements for high-speed cruising. The rounded shapes that seemed unusual in an age of boxy automobiles were functional necessities dictated by physics rather than styling whims. Every engineering choice reflected economy. Air. Cooling eliminated the radiator, water pump, hoses, and coolant that added cost and failure points to conventional designs. The rear engine placement allowed a simpler drivetrain without a drive shaft running the length of the vehicle. Torsion bar suspension replaced conventional springs, reducing weight while improving ride quality. Every component was designed for manufacturing simplicity, parts that could be stamped rather than machined, assemblies that could be completed by workers with minimal training. Porsche's team conducted testing regimes unprecedented for a civilian vehicle. Prototypes accumulated more than 1 million kilometers on German roads, driven by SS personnel who documented every failure and weakness. The testing revealed problems that required engineering solutions: engines that overheated under sustained high-speed operation, heaters that proved inadequate for German winters, seals that emitted water and dust. Each problem generated modifications that improved reliability. Hitler personally approves the prototype on December 29, 1935. The Führer has contributed his own suggestions. The air-cooled engine specifically comes from his insistence that nothing in the vehicle should freeze during German winters. By 1938, after extensive testing, the design reaches final form. Now, the Reich needs a factory capable of building 1.5 million of these cars annually, more than the entire German automobile industry produces in a typical year. The site selection falls to the German Labor Front, the Nazi organization that has absorbed all German trade unions. They choose a location near Fallersleben in Lower Saxony, where the Mittelland Canal provides transportation for raw materials and finished products. An entirely new city will rise alongside the factory, Stadt des KDVF Wagens, the city of the strength through joy car. German planners envision a model community of 90,000 workers and their families, complete with housing, schools, hospitals, and recreational facilities. Construction begins in May 1938, with Hitler laying the foundation stone. Thousands of workers pour concrete foundations into earth that still remembers nothing but farmland. Above them, the air hangs thick with cement dust and diesel exhaust. The Reich pours resources into the project at an astonishing rate. Workers, including many conscripted from occupied territories, pour concrete, erect steel frames, and install machinery imported from across Europe and America. The factory incorporates the latest manufacturing technology: transfer presses from America, welding equipment from Germany, assembly line concepts borrowed directly from Ford's River Rouge complex. The scale of construction dwarfed anything previously attempted in German automotive history. The main factory building stretched 1,500 meters along its longest axis, housing production equipment for every stage of automobile manufacturing. The press shop contained massive hydraulic and mechanical presses capable of forming sheet steel into complex body panels with a single stroke. Paint booths provided controlled environments for applying primers, base coats, and clear coats. Power plants generated electricity for the factory and the growing city. Rail yards connected the factory to the German transportation network. Within 18 months, production halls stand ready for automobile manufacturing. The German Labor Front launches an aggressive savings program to finance purchases. Workers across the Reich sign up for payroll deductions of 5 Reichsmarks weekly. They receive stamps to paste into savings books, tracking their progress toward the 90 Reichsmarks required for a complete purchase. By 1939, 336,000 subscribers contribute approximately 280 million Reichsmarks. This money does not sit in accounts waiting for car deliveries. It finances factory construction, armaments production, and the machinery of the Nazi state. The savings scheme represented a sophisticated financial mechanism wrapped in populist propaganda. Workers believed they were purchasing automobiles through disciplined savings. In reality, they were providing interest-free loans to the Nazi government, loans that would never be repaid. The Reichsmark amounts accumulated in savings books had no legal enforceability, no contract-guaranteed delivery of vehicles, and no timeline specified when purchases would be fulfilled. The program was structured as a promise, not a contract, and promises could be broken without legal consequence. Propaganda materials flood Germany with images of smiling families beside their future automobiles. The KDF wagon appears in advertisements, newsreels, and public exhibitions. Newspapers run stories about the factory's progress, the engineering innovations, the coming transformation of German society. The promise feels tangible. Workers paste stamps into their books, watching the totals climb toward automobile ownership. Factory newsreels show production halls nearing completion. Test vehicles demonstrate performance on Germany's new highways. The future seems close enough to touch. Then, on September 1, 1939, Germany invades Poland. World War II begins. The factory in Wolfsburg has produced exactly 210 civilian vehicles, allocated to Nazi officials and military officers, not to the workers who have saved for years. Automobile production for civilians ceases immediately. The factory converts entirely to war materiel. The savings books become worthless paper. Not a single subscriber ever receives a vehicle. The Volkswagen factory enters the war with a fundamental problem. It was designed to build cars, not weapons. The massive facility, engineered for annual production of 1.5 million civilian vehicles, now requires new products and new processes to serve the German military. Ferdinand Porsche and his engineers adapt the KDF wagon platform for military purposes, creating the Type 82 Kübelwagen, a lightweight, military utility vehicle with increased ground clearance, removable doors, and reduced weight. The Kübelwagen becomes the Wehrmacht's equivalent of the American Jeep, serving in North Africa, the Eastern Front, and the campaigns across Europe. The adaptation process revealed the fundamental soundness of Porsche's original design. The air-cooled engine, chosen for reliability in civilian use, proved equally reliable in military conditions. In the Sahara Desert, where water-cooled engines faced constant overheating problems, the Kübelwagen continued operating. On the Eastern Front, where temperatures dropped far below freezing, the absence of coolant eliminated one common cause of engine failure. The rear engine configuration provided excellent traction in sand and snow, while the lightweight construction allowed the vehicle to be lifted by soldiers when it became stuck. The factory also produces the Schwimmwagen, an amphibious vehicle capable of crossing rivers and operating in flooded terrain. Both vehicles share the air-cooled engine and basic mechanical layout of the civilian KDF wagon, allowing production lines to be adapted rather than entirely rebuilt. In addition to vehicles, the Wolfsburg complex manufactures aircraft components, wing sections for Junkers bombers, fuselage components for fighters, V-1 flying bomb parts, and artillery shell casings. This versatility makes the factory valuable to the Nazi war effort, but this same value creates an insatiable demand for labor that the German workforce cannot satisfy. By summer 1940, the factory begins using forced labor. The first contingent arrives from Poland, young women conscripted in street roundups, transported in cattle cars, and assigned to the assembly lines. Within months, prisoners of war from France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and eventually the Soviet Union join them. The workforce diversifies into a hierarchy of suffering, organized along the Nazi racial classification system. German, civilian workers occupied the most skilled positions, performed the least dangerous tasks, and received wages that supported families. Western European workers from countries deemed racially acceptable, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, received basic wages, lived in barracks that provided minimal comfort, and could occasionally communicate with families at home. Eastern Europeans, Poles, Ukrainians, and others classified as Slavic received reduced rations, lived in more crowded and less sanitary conditions, and faced physical punishment for infractions that would merely result in wage deductions for Western workers. Soviet prisoners of war occupied the bottom of this hierarchy. The Nazi ideology classified Russians as subhuman, undeserving of the protections extended even to other enemies. Soviet prisoners at Volkswagen received starvation rations calculated to extract labor while gradually weakening them. Medical care was minimal or non-existent. Housing consisted of crowded barracks without adequate heating, sanitation, or bedding. Death rates among Soviet prisoners far exceeded those of other worker categories, a result not of war conditions, but of deliberate policy. In April 1942, the factory establishes a concentration camp on its grounds, Arbeitsdorf, one of the earliest camps specifically created to serve industrial production. The SS provides laborers from the broader camp system. The factory provides guards, housing, and the work that justifies the prisoner's existence. Later, Volkswagen becomes a subcamp of the Neuengamme concentration camp, integrating still more deeply into the machinery of Nazi terror. Ferdinand Porsche personally travels to the concentration camps to select workers. In 1944, he visits Auschwitz and chooses 300 skilled metal workers from among the Hungarian Jews arriving on transport trains. Another 650 Jewish women are transferred to assemble military munitions. Company records show that Volkswagen actively sought concentration camp labor, requesting specific numbers and skill sets from SS authorities. This was not passive compliance with government demands. It was active participation in the slave economy of the Third Reich. By 1944, forced laborers constitute approximately 60% of the Volkswagen workforce, an estimated 20,000 people in total. They work alongside German employees and migrant workers recruited from across occupied Europe. The factory operates around the clock, its production demands never slacking despite the deteriorating military situation. Workers live in barracks on factory grounds, segregated by nationality and race. Rations for Eastern workers and concentration camp inmates barely sustain life. Physical violence, exhaustion, and industrial accidents kill hundreds. One of the most horrific chapters involves the children of female forced laborers. As the factory's female workforce grew, pregnancies inevitably occurred, some from relationships among workers, others from assault. Initially, the Nazis deported pregnant workers back to their home countries. But by 1943, the labor shortage had grown so severe that the Reich could not afford to lose workers for any reason. A new policy emerged. The children would be taken from their mothers immediately after birth. Volkswagen established a facility called the Ruin Nursery in a nearby village. The term nursery proved grotesquely misleading. Infants were removed from their mothers within weeks of birth and transported to Ruin, where conditions guaranteed death. Medical care was non-existent. Food consisted of watered-down milk insufficient for infant nutrition. The facility had no heating adequate for winter conditions. Children slept in wooden boxes lined with sawdust. German medical personnel documented the deaths with bureaucratic precision, recording causes that included general weakness and catarrh of the intestines, euphemisms for deliberate starvation and neglect. Historians estimate that 365 infants died at the Ruin facility between 1943 and 1945. The mortality rate approached 100%. This was not incompetence or resource shortage. This was policy. The children of Eastern workers and concentration camp prisoners had no value to the Reich. Their mothers could return to the assembly lines more quickly if the infants disappeared. Volkswagen's factory managers understood these calculations. They participated in them. Allied bombing raids began hitting the Wolfsburg complex in 1944. The factory dispersed production to satellite facilities and underground bunkers, but damage accumulated. By early 1945, the Wehrmacht's collapse was unmistakable. Soviet forces approached from the east. British and American armies pushed from the west. On April 11, 1945, American troops reached Wolfsburg. German personnel fled. The forced laborers emerged from their barracks, liberated but traumatized. Ferdinand Porsche escaped to Austria, transferring 10 million Reichsmarks to personal accounts before departing. His son-in-law, Anton Piesch, who had served as director of the main plant, fled with him. The factory stood damaged but not destroyed, filled with machinery, incomplete vehicles, and the evidence of what had occurred there. The Americans turned Wolfsburg over to the British, whose occupation zone included this section of Germany. The question of what to do with the factory, and with the troubled enterprise called Volkswagen, fell to a 28-year-old British Army officer with an engineering background and a talent for improvisation. Major Ivan Hurst had orders to sit on the factory and prevent looting. He ended up doing something far more consequential. Major Ivan Hurst arrived in Wolfsburg in August 1945 with instructions that offered little guidance. Find the factory, secure it, await further orders. What he found was a production facility two-thirds destroyed by bombing, a city in chaos with refugees streaming from the Soviet zone, and a workforce that had survived forced labor only to face an uncertain future. The original plan called for dismantling the factory as war reparations, shipping the machinery to Allied nations as compensation for German aggression. Several nations sent delegations to evaluate the equipment. None wanted it. Thousands of former forced laborers remained in the vicinity, freed but with nowhere to go. Their home countries lay in ruins or had fallen under Soviet control. German refugees from the east poured into Wolfsburg, fleeing the advancing Red Army. The city's population swelled with displaced persons from across Europe. Food was scarce, housing was damaged or overcrowded, order barely maintained. The British Roots Group sent representatives who examined the factory and the strange little car with its rear-mounted engine and rounded body. Their report was damning. The vehicle does not meet the fundamental technical requirements of a motor car. It is quite unattractive to the average. A motor car buyer, to build the car commercially, would be a completely uneconomic enterprise. American industrialists expressed similar skepticism. Ford Motor Company was offered the factory for free and declined. Henry Ford II visited, examined the facilities, and saw nothing worth salvaging. Ernest Breech, chairman of Ford's board, accompanied him. The factory contained the most modern press equipment in Europe, yet to men accustomed to V8 engines and streamlined styling, the air-cooled economy car seemed like an evolutionary dead end. Hearst saw something different. The British Army in occupied Germany needed transportation. Thousands of vehicles for personnel, supplies, and administration. German roads remained a mess of bomb craters and abandoned equipment. Hearst recognized that the Volkswagen, for all its peculiarities, represented functional transportation that could be manufactured quickly with available resources. He painted a surviving prototype khaki green and demonstrated it to British military authorities. On August 22, 1945, the British Army placed an order for 20,000 vehicles. The order saved the factory from demolition. Now, Hearst faced the challenge of actually building 20,000 cars in a bombed facility with no supply chain, no raw materials, and a workforce that included former forced laborers, German refugees, and demobilized soldiers. Steel was unavailable in large sheets. Workers welded smaller pieces together to form body panels. Glass, rubber, and electrical components arrived through bartering and improvisation. Hearst personally arranged the manufacture of carburetors after discovering that the original supplier had ended up in the Soviet occupation zone. The first post-war Beetle rolled off the assembly line on December 27, 1945. Production that year totaled 1,785 vehicles, far short of the 20,000 ordered, but enough to prove the concept. The following year, production increased to 10,020 vehicles. Quality improved. The supply chain, Eboe, stabilized. The city of Wolfsburg, renamed from Stad des KDF Wagens by British authorities, began to function as a community rather than a refugee camp. Hearst understood that the factory needed permanent German management to survive beyond the occupation. He found Heinrich Nordhoff in the autumn of 1947. Nordhoff had worked for Opel before and during the war, rising to director of their Brandenburg truck plant. His wartime activities had used forced labor, like virtually every German industrial manager, but American denazification authorities had cleared him for employment. When Opel, now under American control, refused to rehire him, Nordhoff accepted Hearst's invitation to take over Volkswagen. Nordhoff arrived on January 1, 1948, to find a factory producing 8,000 vehicles annually with 8,700 employees. The car he inherited was, by his own assessment, riddled with flaws. "The Beetle has more defects than a dog has fleas," he remarked. But Nordhoff also recognized something essential. The basic engineering was sound, and the potential for improvement was enormous. Rather than replace the Beetle with an entirely new design, an approach that would have required capital Volkswagen did not possess, Nordhoff chose continuous refinement. Every component became a candidate for improvement. The engine gained power, the transmission smoothed, the body received better sealing against weather and noise. The currency reform of June 1948 transformed the German economy almost overnight. The worthless Reichsmark was replaced by the Deutsche Mark at a ratio that essentially wiped out accumulated savings but created genuine purchasing power. Suddenly, Germans could buy goods with real money. Consumer demand exploded. Volkswagen sales surged. By the end of 1948, production had reached 19,244 vehicles, more than double the previous year. Nordhoff recognized that the German market alone could not sustain long-term growth. Export markets, particularly the lucrative United States, represented the future. In 1949, Volkswagen shipped 56 Beetles to the Netherlands through Ben Poen, who became the first international importer. That same year, the British military government formally transferred control of Volkswagen to the new Federal Republic of Germany and the state of Lower Saxony. The company that had been founded as a Nazi enterprise, rebuilt by British occupation forces, and managed by a former Opel executive, was now a German corporation responsible to shareholders and governments. The 1950s witnessed a transformation so complete that it seemed designed to obliterate memory. Volkswagen, born from Nazi ideology and built with slave labor, reinvented itself as the engine of West Germany's economic miracle. The Wirtschaftswunder, the economic wonder, lifted Germany from rubble to prosperity within a single decade, and the Beetle became its most visible symbol. Production figures tell the story in cold numbers. In 1950, Volkswagen manufactured 90,038 vehicles. By 1955, that number had grown to 329,893, and the 1 millionth Beetle rolled off the assembly line in Wolfsburg. The factory that occupying powers had nearly demolished now employed more workers than ever, producing cars that sold faster than the company could build them. Waiting lists stretched for months. The growth required constant expansion of production capacity. New manufacturing halls rose alongside the original factory buildings. Second and third shifts extended production around the clock. Additional plants opened at Hanover in 1956, at Kassel for transmission production, at Brunswick for components. The single factory complex, envisioned by Nazi planners, evolved into a network of facilities spread across West Germany. Quality improvements accompanied quantity increases. Nordhoff's insistence on continuous refinement transformed the Beetle from a primitive economy car into a remarkably durable machine. Engine power increased from the original 25 horsepower to 30, then 36, eventually reaching 40 horsepower for the 1200 model. Transmissions gained synchronizers that eliminated the need for double clutching. Body sealing improved to reduce wind noise and water intrusion. Heating systems, notoriously inadequate in early models, were upgraded to provide genuine comfort in German winters. The improvements followed a distinctive philosophy. Rather than introducing visible changes that would make previous models obsolete, Volkswagen refined internal components while maintaining exterior appearance. An owner could drive a 1955 Beetle beside a 1950 model without obvious visual distinction. Yet the newer car would be measurably more refined. This approach contradicted the American practice of annual styling changes designed to stimulate replacement purchases. Volkswagen sold reliability, not fashion. Nordhoff understood that the American market represented the ultimate prize. The United States possessed the largest automotive market in the world, dominated by General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, with their massive V8 sedans and annual styling changes. The Beetle represented the opposite of everything Detroit produced: small, economical, air-cooled, and virtually unchanged from year to year. In 1949, exactly 2 Beetles sold in America. The car seemed hopelessly mismatched for a market that equated size with status and power with prestige. But Nordhoff pursued the American market with relentless patience. Volkswagen of America was established in 1955, with careful attention to dealer selection and service standards. Nordhoff insisted that every Volkswagen dealer maintain inventory of every replacement part. If a Beetle required service, the owner should never wait for parts to arrive. This commitment to service, unusual in an era when many manufacturers treated after-sales support as an afterthought, built a reputation for reliability that distinguished Volkswagen from competitors. The company needed advertising that matched its unconventional product. In 1959, Karl Hahn, president of Volkswagen of America, contracted with Doyle Dane Bernbach, a New York advertising agency that would revolutionize the industry. DDB, led by creative director Bill Bernbach, rejected the bombastic claims and airbrushed fantasies that dominated automotive advertising. Instead, they created campaigns built on wit, understatement, and brutal honesty about the Beetle's limitations. The Think Small advertisement appeared in 1960 and changed advertising forever. Against an ocean of white space, a tiny Beetle sat alone. The headline, Think Small, acknowledged what everyone already knew. This was a small car in a market obsessed with size. But the copy that followed reframed that smallness as virtue. The Beetle used less gas. It cost less to insure. It fit into parking spaces that swallowed American land yachts. The advertisement treated readers as intelligent adults capable of making rational decisions rather than emotional targets for manipulation. The lemon advertisement pushed further. An image of a seemingly perfect Beetle was labeled with the single word lemon, the American slang for a defective car. The copy revealed that this particular vehicle had been rejected by Volkswagen's quality inspectors because of a barely visible blemish on the chrome strip of the glove compartment. The message was clear. Volkswagen's quality control caught defects that other manufacturers would ship to customers. Every Beetle that reached a showroom had passed inspection by inspectors who rejected 3,000 cars daily. These campaigns earned recognition as the greatest advertising of the 20th century. They transformed the Beetle from an oddity into a statement, from a cheap import into a badge of intelligence and nonconformity. By 1965, Volkswagen sold 569,292 vehicles in America, becoming the country's top-selling import. The counterculture embraced the Beetle as an anti-establishment icon. Hippies painted psychedelic designs on VW vans. Students drove Beetles to protest rallies. Disney made a film about a sentient beetle named Herbie. The cultural transformation from Nazi propaganda vehicle to counterculture symbol represents one of the most remarkable rebranding achievements in corporate history. The car that Hitler had intended as a demonstration of National Socialist achievement became associated with peace movements, artistic communities, and rejection of mainstream consumer values. Volkswagen's marketing never explicitly addressed this irony. Instead, the advertising focused so intensely on the car's practical virtues that its origins receded from public consciousness. The Type 2 Transporter, introduced in 1950, extended the Beetle's appeal into commercial and recreational markets. Built on a chassis derived from the Beetle's platform, but with the engine relocated beneath the rear floor, the Transporter provided cargo capacity impossible in the compact sedan. Commercial variants served businesses as delivery vehicles. Passenger variants, known as microbuses or combis, carried families and became iconic transportation for surf culture, camping enthusiasts, and eventually the hippie movement that adopted them as symbols of alternative lifestyles. The numbers kept climbing. On February 17, 1972, Volkswagen produced the 15,734th Beetle, surpassing the Ford Model T as the most produced automobile in history. The company donated the record-breaking car to the Smithsonian Institution. Media coverage celebrated Volkswagen's achievement as a triumph of German engineering and marketing genius. By the early 1970s, however, the Beetle faced a problem that no advertising campaign could solve. The design was 40 years old. Competitors had caught up. Japanese manufacturers offered small cars with front-wheel drive, water-cooled engines, and modern styling that made the Beetle look like a relic. The oil crisis of 1973 increased demand for fuel-efficient vehicles, but the Beetle's fuel economy no longer represented a meaningful advantage over contemporary designs. Sales in North America peaked in 1970 at 569,192 vehicles and began a steady decline. Nordhoff had recognized this problem years earlier. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, he spent more than 200 million Deutsche Marks on prototypes intended to replace or supplement the Beetle. None reached production. Some failed technically. Others seemed too radical. Nordhoff's inability to authorize a genuine successor left Volkswagen dangerously dependent on a single aging product. When he died of a heart attack in April 1968, the company faced an existential challenge: how to transition from the Beetle to something new before the market abandoned them entirely. The answer came from an unexpected source. In 1964, Volkswagen had acquired Auto Union from Daimler-Benz for 297 million Deutsche Marks. The purchase included the Audi brand and more. Importantly, a team of engineers experienced with front-wheel drive and water-cooled engines, technologies Volkswagen had never mastered. From this acquisition came the platform that would eventually produce the Golf, Passat, and Polo. The crisis arrived with brutal clarity in 1974. Volkswagen's production at Wolfsburg, which had built nearly 12 million Beetles since the war, ceased manufacturing the iconic car. European production continued briefly at the Emden plant before ending entirely in January 1978. The car that had defined Volkswagen for 4 decades would continue only in Brazil and Mexico, far from the company's headquarters. In its place came a new generation of vehicles that shared nothing with the Beetle except a manufacturing location. The Golf, introduced in 1974, represented everything the Beetle was not: front-wheel drive, water-cooled engine, modern hatchback styling, designed by Giorgetto Giugiaro. The engineering came largely from Audi, the subsidiary acquired a decade earlier. Known as the Rabbit in North America, it offered the practicality and efficiency that had attracted Beetle buyers, combined with contemporary performance and amenities. The GTI variant, introduced in 1976, created an entirely new market segment, the hot hatch, that combined sporting performance with everyday utility. But Volkswagen's transformation extended far beyond a single new model. The company pursued a strategy of brand acquisition and geographic expansion that would ultimately create the largest automotive conglomerate in Europe. In 1982, Volkswagen signed a cooperation agreement with Seat, the Spanish automaker. 4 years later, it acquired a 75% stake, making Seat the first non-German brand in the Volkswagen portfolio. In 1991, Volkswagen purchased Škoda, the Czech manufacturer, extending its reach into Eastern Europe as communist regimes collapsed. Both brands maintained distinct identities while sharing platforms, powertrains, and components. Seat offered styling with Mediterranean flair, positioned slightly below Volkswagen in price. Škoda, after billions in modernization investments, became one of the fastest-growing automotive brands in Europe, offering value-oriented alternatives to Volkswagen's mainstream models. The acquisitions accelerated in 1998. Volkswagen purchased Bentley from Vickers, adding British luxury to its portfolio. The same year brought Bugatti, the legendary French marque dormant since the 1950s, and Lamborghini, the Italian supercar manufacturer. Ferdinand Piëch, grandson of Ferdinand Porsche, and now chairman of Volkswagen's supervisory board, drove these acquisitions with a vision of transforming Volkswagen into a full-spectrum automotive empire, from budget Škodas to million-dollar Bugattis. Bugatti's revival represented pure ambition. Volkswagen developed the Veyron supercar as a technological showcase. The Veyron's 1,001 horsepower engine, top speed exceeding 400 kilometers per hour and price approaching 1.5 million euros, positioned it as the ultimate expression of automotive engineering. Whether it made business sense was almost irrelevant. It demonstrated Volkswagen's capabilities at the extreme end of the market. The relationship between Volkswagen and Porsche, intertwined since the 1930s, entered a new phase in the 2000s. Porsche, the company founded by the Beatles designer, began acquiring Volkswagen shares in 2005. By 2008, Porsche controlled more than 42% of Volkswagen and held options on another 31%. The smaller company appeared poised to swallow its larger relative in an audacious takeover. But the 2008 financial crisis disrupted these plans. Porsche accumulated approximately 13 billion euros in debt financing the acquisition attempt. When credit markets froze, Porsche faced potential bankruptcy. The rescue came from an unlikely direction. Volkswagen acquired Porsche's automotive division, completing the merger in 2012. The Porsche and Piëch families, descendants of Ferdinand Porsche and his son-in-law, Anton Piëch, retained control through Porsche SE, a holding company that owned the majority of Volkswagen's voting shares. The man who had designed Hitler's People's Car had, through his descendants, come to control the company that Hitler had created to build it. By the early 2010s, the Volkswagen Group operated 12 brands across every market segment. Annual production exceeded 10 million vehicles. The company ranked as the largest automotive manufacturer in the world by sales in 2016 and 2017. Revenue approached $300 billion. Employment exceeded 650,000 workers globally. The factory at Wolfsburg alone employed more than 60,000 people. Yet beneath this apparent success, problems accumulated. Volkswagen's corporate culture had developed peculiarities that would prove catastrophic. Management style was famously autocratic. Executives who challenged decisions faced career consequences. Engineering teams operated under intense pressure to meet targets that sometimes conflicted with regulatory requirements. and the company had developed an obsession with diesel automobiles in the United States. The deception began in the 2009 model year and continued for 7 years. Volkswagen engineers developed software they called the acoustic function, a benign-sounding name for a sophisticated defeat device designed to detect when vehicles were undergoing emissions testing. During tests, the software activated full emissions controls, producing nitrogen oxide levels that met regulatory standards. During normal driving, the software reduced those controls, allowing engines to operate more efficiently, while emitting up to 40 times the legal limit of nitrogen oxides. The mechanism was elegantly simple. Testing protocols followed predictable patterns. Vehicles positioned on dynamometers with only the drive wheels turning, steering wheels stationary, and specific speed. Profiles maintained. The defeat device monitored these conditions and adjusted engine operation accordingly. Modern diesel engines use multiple technologies to reduce nitrogen oxide emissions: exhaust gas recirculation routes, engine exhaust back through the combustion chamber. Selective catalytic reduction injects urea-based fluid into the exhaust stream. Diesel particulate filters capture soot particles. Each technology imposes costs: reduced fuel economy, regular refilling of fluid tanks, periodic regeneration that consumes fuel. Volkswagen's engineers faced pressure to deliver diesel vehicles that offered the fuel economy and performance American buyers expected without these inconveniences. The defeat device allowed Volkswagen to deliver on its marketing promise, but only through deception. Vehicles that appeared to meet emissions standards in testing actually violated those standards by enormous margins during normal operation. Approximately 11 million vehicles worldwide that received this software. In the United States alone, 500,000 cars contained defeat devices. Volkswagen marketed these vehicles as clean diesel, claiming environmental benefits that directly contradicted their actual emissions performance. The entire marketing campaign was built on fraud. The scheme might have continued indefinitely had researchers not grown curious about why European diesel vehicles seemed to produce such different emissions in laboratory testing versus real-world driving. In 2013, the International Council on Clean Transportation commissioned West Virginia University to conduct on-road emissions testing. The Volkswagens produced nitrogen oxide emissions 5 to 35 times higher on the road than in the laboratory. For more than a year, Volkswagen stonewalled. Company representatives blamed differences on various technical issues and unexpected in-use conditions, without acknowledging the defeat device. Only after the EPA threatened to withhold certification for 2016 diesel models did Volkswagen finally admit the truth in September 2015. The consequences proved staggering. Volkswagen's stock price dropped by a third within days. CEO Martin Winterkorn resigned. In January 2017, Volkswagen pleaded guilty to 3 criminal felony counts: conspiracy to defraud the United States, obstruction of justice, and importing vehicles through fraud. The company agreed to pay $2.8 billion in criminal penalties. Civil settlements added another $14.7 billion. Individual executives faced prosecution. Oliver Schmidt, head of Volkswagen's Engineering and Environmental Office in America, received a 7-year prison sentence. Martin Winterkorn himself faced charges in Germany. His trial began in 2024. The years following Dieselgate forced Volkswagen into a reinvention as dramatic as its post-war transformation. The company pledged to become a leader in electric vehicle production, committing €50 billion to electrification by 2023. The pivot to electric vehicles required fundamental changes in how Volkswagen designed, manufactured, and sold automobiles. Internal combustion engines had defined automotive engineering for more than a century. The shift to electric powertrains rendered much of that accumulated knowledge obsolete. Engine plants had no role in electric vehicle production. Transmission facilities designed for multi-speed gearboxes became unnecessary. The skills that German workers had developed over generations faced obsolescence. The Modular Electric Drive Matrix, or MEB platform, became Volkswagen's foundation for electric vehicle production. Battery packs occupied the floor between the axles, lowering the center of gravity and maximizing interior space. Electric motors could be mounted at the front axle, rear axle, or both for all-wheel drive configurations. The ID.3, introduced in 2019, became Volkswagen's flagship electric vehicle for Europe, a Golf-sized hatchback built on a dedicated electric platform. The ID.4 SUV followed for global markets. Volkswagen announced plans to phase out internal combustion engines entirely by 2035. But the electric transition revealed new vulnerabilities. Building electric vehicles required capabilities that Volkswagen had never developed internally: software development, battery manufacturing, charging infrastructure. The company's CARIAD software subsidiary became a source of embarrassment as software development delays pushed back vehicle launches and produced buggy initial releases. Chinese competitors, particularly BYD, demonstrated that they could produce electric vehicles with superior software, longer range, and lower prices than anything Volkswagen offered. China had been Volkswagen's most profitable market for decades, generating up to 40% of company profits. German engineering and quality commanded premiums that Chinese consumers willingly paid. But the electric vehicle revolution shifted competitive advantages. Chinese manufacturers controlled battery supply chains, produced at lower costs, and developed software features that German engineers struggled to match. By 2024, Volkswagen's Chinese joint ventures reported profits 40% lower than the previous year. BYD's rise exemplified the competitive threat. Founded as a battery manufacturer, the company had expanded into automobiles with electric vehicles that integrated powertrains and batteries at a level of optimization that separate suppliers could not achieve. BYD's blade battery technology offered safety and energy density improvements while reducing costs. By 2024, BYD sold more electric vehicles than any company except Tesla. The European market provided no refuge. Overall demand for automobiles remained below pre-pandemic levels, with Volkswagen producing approximately 2 million fewer cars than in 2019 despite maintaining nearly the same workforce. Production facilities operated at two-thirds capacity or less. In September 2024, Volkswagen announced measures that would have been inconceivable a decade earlier. The company terminated its job security agreement with workers in place since 1994 and warned that plant closures in Germany might be necessary for the first time in the company's 87-year history. In December 2024, 100,000 workers walked off the job in warning strikes. The confrontation produced a negotiated settlement in December 2024. Volkswagen would eliminate 35,000 jobs by 2030, roughly 1 in 4 positions in Germany, through retirements and voluntary departures rather than layoffs. Production capacity would decrease by 700,000 vehicles annually. The transparent factory in Dresden would close. Golf production would relocate to Mexico. The company projected savings of 15 billion euros annually. These cuts reflected deeper structural problems facing the German automotive industry as a whole. Energy costs, elevated since the disruption of Russian gas supplies, made German manufacturing more expensive than competitors. Labor costs at Wolfsburg, averaging approximately $80,000 per worker, exceeded those at Mexican facilities by a factor of 4. The crisis extended beyond Volkswagen. Mercedes-Benz, BMW, and their supplier networks announced tens of thousands of job cuts. The German automotive industry faced what analysts called its Detroit moment. The factory at Wolfsburg still stands, sprawling across the same marshland where Hitler laid the foundation stone in 1938. The production halls that built Kübelwagens for the Wehrmacht now produce ID.3 electric vehicles and Golfs for global markets. The city that rose alongside the factory remains utterly dependent on Volkswagen for employment, tax revenue, and economic activity. Wolfsburg presents a case study in industrial dependency. Unlike historic German cities with diversified economies and centuries of urban development, Wolfsburg exists solely because Volkswagen exists. Suppliers cluster around the factory. Restaurants serve factory workers. Schools educate children of factory families. The entire civic infrastructure assumes continued industrial activity at scales that may no longer be sustainable. 87 years have passed since Ferdinand Porsche designed the people's car at Hitler's command. In those decades, the company has manufactured more than 100 million vehicles across its brands. It has employed millions of workers, created fortunes for the Porsche and Piech families, and transformed itself from a Nazi propaganda project into a global industrial empire. The Beetle that no German civilian ever received from the original savings scheme became the most produced car in history. In 2023, Volkswagen Group sold approximately 9 million vehicles, generated revenue exceeding 320 billion euros, and employed more than 680,000 workers globally. These numbers would have been unimaginable to the Nazi planners who conceived the original factory, or to the British officers who debated dismantling it after the war. Yet, the shadows persist. Volkswagen acknowledged its wartime use of forced labor in 1986, commissioning historian Hans Mommsen to produce an independent corporate history. In 1991, the company provided 12 million Deutsche Marks for humanitarian projects supporting former forced laborers. In 1998, facing lawsuits from Holocaust survivors, Volkswagen established a fund specifically for compensation. These measures came decades after the crimes, offered modest sums relative to corporate profits, and reached only a fraction of those who had suffered. The compensation efforts arrived too late for most victims. Forced laborers from the 1940s reached advanced age in the 1990s, and many died before receiving any acknowledgement. The Ruhin Infant Cemetery, where 365 children of forced laborers lie buried, received a memorial in 1980. But Ferdinand Porsche and Anton Piech, the men who ran the factory, requested concentration camp laborers and profited from their exploitation. Died free men. The doctor who oversaw the Ruin facility was executed by the British. The nurse in charge served 8 years in prison before returning to work at Volkswagen as a social worker. The Dieselgate scandal demonstrated that Volkswagen's capacity for deception did not end with the war. For years, engineers developed software to deceive regulators, while marketing executives claimed environmental benefits that did not exist. The fraud was detected by external researchers, not internal compliance, revealed only under legal pressure, not corporate conscience. The Porsche and Piech families still control the company through their majority stake in Porsche SE. The descendants of Ferdinand Porsche, the engineer who joined the Nazi Party in 1937, served as an SS Oberfuhrer, designed military vehicles that killed Allied soldiers, and selected concentration camp inmates for his workforce, remain the ultimate authority over Volkswagen's future. The wealth that these families control originated in a factory built by slave labor for a Nazi government. What obligations, if any, attach to wealth accumulated through historical crimes? Should the passage of time and the succession of generations erase the moral taint of origins? These questions have no easy answers, and reasonable people disagree. The Beetle is dead, finally and completely. Production ended in Mexico in 2003, and the retro-style New Beetle and its successor failed to recapture the original's cultural significance. The car that symbolized post-war redemption exists now only in museums, collections, and memory. Now the company faces a new reckoning. Chinese competitors threaten the markets that Volkswagen has dominated for decades. Electric vehicle production requires capabilities the company has struggled to develop. German manufacturing costs make the homeland increasingly uncompetitive. 35,000 workers will lose their jobs. The workers who built Volkswagen's post-war success believed that their company reciprocated their loyalty. The job security agreement signed in 1994 formalized this understanding. The company's decision to terminate this agreement represented a fundamental breach of the social contract that had made German industrial relations a model for the developed world. What seems certain is that the company cannot escape its history through growth alone. Volkswagen became the largest automaker in Europe, owned the most prestigious brands in the industry, employed hundreds of thousands of workers, and still carried the weight of its origins. The emissions scandal revealed that the culture which enabled wartime atrocities had evolved, but not fundamentally changed. The willingness to deceive regulators and customers echoed, in a lesser register, the willingness to exploit forced laborers. The thread connecting 1938 to 2015 was not broken by decades of commercial success. The story began with a promise that was never kept. 336,000 Germans saved their Reichsmarks for cars they never received. The story continues with new promises: electric vehicles that will restore competitiveness, job cuts that will restore profitability, transformation that will secure the future. Whether these promises will prove more reliable than Hitler's remains to be seen. The factory still stands, the work continues, the history remains.